Franz Kafka. The name itself seems to conjure shadows, labyrinthine corridors, and the quiet dread of bureaucratic absurdity. Born into the twilight years of the Austro-Hungarian Empire on the 3rd of July, 1883, his life began in the heart of Prague, a city steeped in myth, history, and the uneasy coexistence of Czech, German, and Jewish cultures. This complex urban tapestry, with its layers of language, tradition, and simmering national tensions, would profoundly shape the consciousness of the man who would become one of the most enigmatic and influential writers of the 20th century. His life, much like his fiction, was a complex narrative woven with threads of familial tension, existential anxiety, artistic ambition, and the relentless pursuit of an elusive meaning in a world that often felt alienating and incomprehensible. He entered this world in Prague's Old Town, specifically in an apartment situated at the corner of Karpfengasse and Meiselgasse, within the former Jewish ghetto. He was the firstborn son of Hermann Kafka and Julie Lovi Kafka. Hermann, a formidable figure whose imposing presence and booming voice would loom large over Franz's life and work, was the epitome of the self-made man. Born into poverty in a rural Jewish community in southern Bohemia, he had risen through sheer force of will, military service, and relentless business acumen to become a successful haberdashery wholesaler in Prague. He embodied the practical, assertive, and often authoritarian values of the burgeoning bourgeoisie, valuing strength, success, and conformity above all else. His physical robustness and worldly confidence stood in stark contrast to his eldest son's perceived frailty and sensitivity. Julie Kafka offered a different model. She came from a more educated and prosperous German-speaking Jewish family in Podobrady, the daughter of a brewer. Quieter, more introspective, and perhaps more attuned to the sensitivities that her eldest son would inherit, she represented a connection to a more refined cultural background. However, her energy was largely consumed by assisting Hermann in the demanding family business and managing the household, leaving her, in Franz's later perception, often emotionally distant or unavailable. This fundamental difference in parental temperaments and backgrounds, coupled with the pressures of assimilation and social mobility, created an undercurrent of tension within the household, a dynamic that Franz would internalize and explore throughout his writings, most notably in his famous Letter to His Father. The early years of the Kafka family were tragically marked by loss, experiences that undoubtedly cast a shadow over the household atmosphere. Two younger brothers, Georg, born in 1884, and Heinrich, born in 1885, both died in infancy, Georg at 15 months, Heinrich at just 6. While Franz may not have consciously remembered these events, the presence of death so early in the family narrative may have contributed to the pervasive sense of fragility, guilt, and loss that permeates his work. The survival of the eldest son, while his brothers perished, could have subtly shaped his relationship with his parents and his own sense of identity. The family structure solidified with the arrival of three sisters: Gabriele, known affectionately as Ellie, born in 1886, Valerie, or Vali, born in 1889, and Ottilie, called Otla, born in 1886-1892. Otla, the youngest, would become Franz's closest confidant within the family, a source of unwavering support, practical help, and emotional understanding in an often stifling environment. Her independent spirit and willingness to defy their father offered Franz a model of resistance he admired but struggled to emulate. The tragic fate of all three sisters, murdered during the Holocaust decades after Franz's own death, underscores the vulnerability of the world into which they were born. As Hermann Kafka's business prospered, the family moved to progressively larger and more fashionable apartments, reflecting their rising social status within Prague's German-speaking Jewish community. Yet, despite the material comforts, Franz often felt like an outsider within his own family circle. His relationship with his father remained the central defining conflict of his youth. Hermann's relentless drive, his dismissal of Franz's artistic inclinations, His often harsh judgments and his overwhelming physical presence fostered in Franz profound feelings of inadequacy, guilt, fear, and a deep-seated alienation. This paternal judgment cast a long shadow, shaping Franz's self-perception and becoming a central theme in his literary universe, where father figures often appear as distant, arbitrary, and terrifyingly powerful. His mother, Julie, while perhaps more sympathetic by nature, was often caught between her husband's demands and her son's needs. Her loyalty to Hermann and her absorption in the family business limited her ability to act as a buffer or provide the consistent emotional validation Franz craved. Consequently, the household staff, a succession of governesses, cooks and maids, played a significant role in Franz's daily upbringing, further complicating his sense of belonging and contributing to his feeling of being fundamentally misunderstood. In 1889, at the age of 6, Franz began his formal education at the German primary school for boys, Deutsche Knabenschule, located in Massner Street, then known as Fleischmarkt. This marked his entry into the German language educational system of Prague, a choice reflecting the family's assimilationist aspirations within the German-speaking minority of the predominantly Czech city. For Franz, it was the beginning of a long, often arduous journey through institutional structures, schools, offices, legal systems, that he frequently found oppressive, impersonal, and alienating, settings that would later provide the backdrop for many of his most characteristic fictional worlds. In 1893, at the age of 10, Franz progressed from the German primary school to the German state grammar school, Gymnasium, housed in the imposing rear wing of the Goltskinsky Palace on Prague's Old Town Square. This prestigious institution, with its neo-Renaissance facade and formal academic atmosphere, represented the pinnacle of German language education in Prague and served as a crucible for the city's future German-speaking elite. For the next 8 years, this would be the setting for Franz's intellectual development, social formation, and increasingly, his sense of alienation from conventional paths and expectations. The gymnasium's curriculum was rigorously classical, emphasizing Latin, Greek, German literature, mathematics, and history. The pedagogical approach favored rote memorization, strict discipline, and unquestioning respect for authority, methods that did little to nurture Kafka's creative spirit or accommodate his introspective nature. The school day typically began at 8 in the morning and continued until early afternoon, 6 days a week, with students expected to complete several additional hours of homework each evening. This demanding schedule left little time for personal exploration or creative pursuits, creating a tension between academic obligations and artistic inclinations that would persist throughout Kafka's life. The physical environment of the school itself, with its echoing corridors, hierarchical seating arrangements, and formal, often intimidating teachers, later found echoes in Kafka's fictional institutions, where individuals navigate labyrinthine structures governed by inscrutable rules. Years later, in conversations with his friend Gustav Janusz, Kafka would describe his school days as a form of imprisonment, noting that the bars were invisible, which made escape seem even more hopeless. Despite his discomfort with the educational environment, Kafka was a conscientious student who performed admirably. His natural intelligence, linguistic aptitude, and meticulous attention to detail ensured that he met the school's demanding standards, even as he privately questioned their value and relevance. His report cards consistently showed high marks, particularly in German, Latin, and Greek. But this academic success, however, came at a psychological cost. The pressure to excel, to meet both the school's standards and his father's expectations, fostered in Kafka a pattern of anxious perfectionism and a tendency to measure his worth through external validation, traits that would later complicate his relationship with his own writing. It was during these formative years at the gymnasium that Kafka formed several important friendships that would influence his intellectual development and provide crucial emotional support. Among his classmates were Oskar Pollock, who would become an art historian. Rudolf Illovy, later a poet and journalist. Hugo Bergman, who would develop into a significant philosopher. And Ewald Felix Seabram, whose father directed the Workers' Accident Insurance Institute, where Kafka would later spend most of his professional life. These relationships offered Kafka intellectual stimulation, cultural exchange, and a sense of belonging that he often found lacking at home. These school friendships were characterized by intense discussions of literature, philosophy, and politics. Conversations that continued in Prague's coffee houses and on long walks through the city's winding streets. Through these exchanges, Kafka was exposed to a wide range of ideas and artistic movements, from German Romanticism to Russian realism, from Nietzschean philosophy to emerging modernist aesthetics. These influences would later be absorbed and transformed in his highly distinctive literary vision. In 1896, at 13, Franz celebrated his bar mitzvah, marking his formal entry into the Jewish community. The ceremony took place at the Zigeuner Synagogue in Prague's Jewish quarter, with family members and friends in attendance. For Kafka, this ritual represented less a profound spiritual milestone than a cultural obligation, reflecting the complex and somewhat ambivalent relationship with Judaism that characterized many assimilated Jewish families in Prague at the time. The Kafka family's approach to their Jewish heritage was typical of the German-speaking Jewish bourgeoisie of Prague. They observed major holidays and traditions more out of cultural habit and social convention than deep religious conviction. Hermann Kafka attended synagogue on high holy days, but showed little interest in religious study or spiritual matters. Julie maintained certain Jewish household customs, but was not particularly observant. This nominal connection to Judaism, combined with their aspirations toward assimilation into German culture, created a sense of being caught between worlds, neither fully embraced by the dominant Christian society nor deeply rooted in Jewish tradition. This liminal position, this experience of being simultaneously insider and outsider, would become a central theme in Kafka's writing and his understanding of his own identity. As he progressed through adolescence, Kafka's intellectual horizons expanded considerably beyond the confines of the gymnasium curriculum. By 1899, at 16, he was independently exploring the works of philosophers and scientists whose ideas challenged conventional wisdom and offered radical new perspectives on human existence, morality, and the natural world. Friedrich Nietzsche's critique of traditional morality and his concept of the will to power made a particularly strong impression on the young Kafka, as did Charles Darwin's evolutionary theories, which undermined religious accounts of human origins and purpose. Baruch Spinoza's rational approach to ethics and his pantheistic vision of God as identical with nature offered yet another framework for questioning orthodox beliefs. These intellectual explorations were conducted largely in private, through books borrowed from friends or from Prague's libraries. They represented Kafka's growing independence of mind and his search for alternatives to the conventional worldviews presented by school and family. The tension between these private intellectual adventures and the public conformity expected of him contributed to his developing sense of leading a double life, a division between inner and outer realities that would become characteristic of both his personal experience and his literary vision. Around 1900, at 17, Kafka began his first serious attempts at creative writing. These early literary efforts, most of which have been lost to time, were likely influenced by the German Romantic authors he admired, such as Heinrich von Kleist, E.T.A. Hoffmann, and Franz Grillparzer. They marked the beginning of his lifelong commitment to literary expression as a means of processing his experiences, exploring his inner landscape, and attempting to make sense of a world that often seemed fundamentally absurd and impenetrable. Writing quickly became for Kafka not merely a hobby or even a vocation, but a necessity, a form of spiritual and psychological survival in a world where he felt perpetually out of place. In his diary, he would later write, "Writing is a form of prayer. suggesting the almost religious significance he attached to the act of literary creation. Yet even in these early efforts, Kafka was plagued by self-doubt and a harsh inner critic that would continue to torment him throughout his career, leading him to destroy much of his work and to publish relatively little during his lifetime. In 1901, Kafka graduated from the gymnasium with good grades, despite his profound dislike for the school environment. His final examination results were strong enough to secure his admission to university, opening the door to higher education, a privilege not available to all in the stratified society of turn-of-the-century Prague. With his secondary education complete, Kafka stood at the threshold of adulthood, facing decisions about his future path that would shape the course of his life and work. The graduation ceremony, held in the ornate assembly hall of the gymnasium, was a moment of both achievement and anxiety for Kafka. While he had successfully navigated the demands of the educational system, he remained uncertain about his true calling and apprehensive about the expectations that would now be placed upon him to choose a respectable profession. His father, Hermann, had clear ideas about his son's future. He should pursue a practical career that would ensure financial security and social standing. Franz's own inclinations toward literature and philosophy were viewed as impractical indulgences, acceptable as hobbies but not as serious life choices. This fundamental conflict between paternal expectations and personal inclinations, between practical considerations and artistic aspirations, would define much of Kafka's adult life. The completion of his gymnasium education marked not an end, but a new beginning in this ongoing struggle to reconcile external demands with internal truths, a struggle that would find its most profound expression in his literary work. The autumn of 1901 marked a significant transition in Kafka's life as he enrolled at the German Karl Ferdinand University in Prague. Founded in 1348 by Emperor Charles IV, it was one of the oldest universities in Central Europe and a bastion of German language education in the predominantly Czech city. The imposing neo-Renaissance university buildings, situated near the Vltava River, housed faculties of law, medicine, philosophy, and theology, drawing students from across the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Initially, Kafka chose to study chemistry, a decision that reflected less his personal interest than an attempt to pursue a practical, scientifically oriented path that might meet with his father's approval. Hermann Kafka, ever practical and concerned with financial security, had made it clear that he expected his son to choose a respectable profession that would ensure a stable future. Chemistry, with its applications in industry and manufacturing, seemed to offer such prospects. However, this first academic choice proved a false start. After just 2 weeks of attending chemistry lectures and laboratory sessions, Kafka found himself profoundly unsuited to and uninterested in the subject. The precise, methodical nature of chemical experimentation did not align with his more introspective and humanistic inclinations. The laboratory environment, with its emphasis on concrete results and empirical observation, felt alien to a mind more attuned to abstract thought and imaginative exploration. With characteristic honesty, Kafka acknowledged this mismatch and made the decision to switch to law. This choice represented a carefully calibrated compromise between his own inclinations and his father's expectations. Law was a respectable profession that could provide financial security and social standing. Yet it also engaged with questions of justice, authority, and human relations that interested the young Kafka. Moreover, a legal career offered various potential paths, from private practice to government service, providing some flexibility within a structured professional framework. The law faculty at Karl Ferdinand University was traditional in its approach, emphasizing the memorization of legal codes and precedents rather than critical analysis or philosophical inquiry. Courses covered Roman law, Austrian civil and criminal codes, commercial law, and legal history. The teaching was formal and hierarchical, with professors lecturing from elevated podiums to rows of students expected to absorb and reproduce the material with minimal questioning or debate. While Kafka dutifully attended his law lectures and completed the required coursework, his true passions lay elsewhere. He supplemented his legal education with courses in German studies and art history, fields more aligned with his literary and aesthetic interests. Professor August Sauer's lectures on German literature introduced him to canonical works and contemporary developments in German language writing. Art history courses exposed him to various artistic movements and aesthetic theories, broadening his cultural horizons beyond the practical focus of his legal studies. The university environment offered greater freedom than the regimented gymnasium, allowing Kafka to explore ideas and form connections with like-minded individuals. The institution's libraries provided access to a wide range of books and journals that nourished his intellectual curiosity. The university's location in central Prague meant that cafes, theatres, and literary salons were within easy reach, offering venues for discussion and cultural engagement beyond formal academic settings. One such connection formed during these university years would prove particularly significant for Kafka's life and literary legacy. In 1902, during his second year at university, Kafka met Max Brod for the first time at a lecture given by philosopher Christian von Ehrenfels at the German Students' Reading and Rhetorical Club. The meeting was inauspicious. Brod initially found Kafka's comments on the lecture too abstract and too intellectual, but it marked the beginning of what would become one of the most important friendships in literary history. Max Brod, a year younger than Kafka but already established in Prague's German literary circles, was in many ways Kafka's opposite. Where Kafka was reserved, often pessimistic, and meticulously slow in his writing, Brod was outgoing, optimistic, and remarkably prolific. He wrote novels, essays, music criticism, and philosophical works with seemingly effortless energy. Despite these contrasting temperaments, or perhaps because of them, they formed a deep and lasting friendship based on mutual respect and shared intellectual interests. Brod quickly recognized Kafka's extraordinary literary talent and became his most ardent champion. He encouraged Kafka's writing, offered feedback on his work, and later facilitated his first publications. This friendship would endure until Kafka's death in 1924 and beyond, for it was Brod who, disregarding Kafka's instructions to destroy his unpublished manuscripts, preserved and published the works that established Kafka's posthumous literary reputation. Through Brod, Kafka was introduced to the wider circle of German writing authors in Prague, becoming a member of what was informally known as the Prague Circle in 1904. This group included philosopher and Zionist Felix Welch, writer Oscar Baum, and other intellectuals who gathered regularly in cafes like the Arco and the Louvre to discuss literature, philosophy, politics, and art. These connections provided Kafka with intellectual stimulation and a sense of community, even as he remained somewhat apart, observing and absorbing rather than fully participating in the group's social dynamics. The Prague Circle represented a unique cultural phenomenon, a German-language literary community in a predominantly Czech city, largely Jewish in composition but engaged with broader European intellectual currents. Its members navigated multiple identities and influences, creating a distinctive literary sensibility that combined German expressionism, Jewish traditions, and Czech cultural elements. Within this stimulating but complex environment, Kafka found both inspiration and a heightened awareness of his own liminal position between cultures and communities. It was during these university years, specifically in 1904 to 1905, that Kafka wrote his first significant short story, Description of a Struggle. The story, with its dreamlike narrative shifts and surreal transformations, already displayed many of the themes and stylistic elements that would characterize his mature fiction. A sense of alienation, the struggle for connection, and a blurring of boundaries between reality and fantasy. Though it would not be published until after his death, This early work represented an important step in Kafka's development as a writer, establishing patterns and preoccupations that would persist throughout his literary career. The writing process for Description of a Struggle established what would become Kafka's preferred creative routine. He would work late at night after his university classes and other obligations were complete, writing in the quiet of his room while the rest of the household slept. This nocturnal schedule allowed him to immerse himself fully in his fictional worlds, free from interruptions and the practical demands of daily life. It also, however, contributed to his chronic exhaustion and health problems, creating a pattern of physical strain that would continue throughout his working life. Despite his growing commitment to literature, Kafka remained dedicated to his academic pursuits. The years 1905 to 1906 saw him taking recreation and recuperation trips to the climatic sanatorium in Zugmüntel, now Zlaté Hory in the Czech Republic, due to health concerns, an early indication of the physical frailty that would plague him throughout his life. These health issues included frequent headaches, anxiety, insomnia, and digestive problems, a constellation of symptoms that would later be understood as manifestations of the psychological stress he experienced in trying to balance his creative vocation with practical obligations. During school breaks, he also took health holidays to the Vltava, Berunka, and Sazava rivers, often accompanied by Max Brod or other friends. These excursions into the Bohemian countryside provided respite from the pressures of academic life and his often tense home environment. Kafka was an avid swimmer and enjoyed outdoor activities, finding in physical exercise and natural surroundings a temporary release from his habitual introspection and anxiety. He also visited his uncle Siegfried Loewy in Třešť, a small town in Moravia where his mother's family had roots. These visits connected him to a different aspect of his Jewish heritage, the rural, small-town Jewish communities that contrasted with the assimilated, urban Jewish culture of Prague. As his university studies progressed, Kafka began to prepare for his final examinations and the completion of his law degree. This period was marked by intense study and increasing pressure. The rigor of the Austrian legal education system required mastery of extensive material and successful performance in both written and oral examinations. For Kafka, with his perfectionist tendencies and fear of failure, this was a time of considerable stress and self-doubt. On June 18, 1906, Kafka's formal education culminated in his obtaining a doctorate in law. The doctoral ceremony, held in the university's Carolinum Hall, marked his official entry into the ranks of the educated professional class. His dissertation, though not preserved, would have been a formal academic exercise rather than an expression of personal intellectual interests. The achievement represented the successful completion of a path he had embarked upon more out of duty than passion. Yet it equipped him with the credentials necessary for professional advancement in the bureaucratic world of early 20th century Prague. Following university tradition, Kafka next undertook a one-year mandatory legal practice in the civil and criminal courts of Prague from 1906 to 1907. This practical training exposed him to the day-to-day workings of the legal system, the procedures, hierarchies, and human dramas that unfolded in the courtrooms and offices of the judicial apparatus. He observed trials, assisted in case preparation, and gained first-hand experience of the often arbitrary and impersonal nature of legal proceedings. This immersion in the labyrinthine world of legal procedures and bureaucracy would later feature prominently in works like The Trial, where the protagonist Joseph K. finds himself caught in an incomprehensible legal process. The arbitrary nature of justice, the impenetrable complexity of institutional processes, and the powerlessness of individuals within these systems all made a profound impression on the young lawyer. His experiences during this year of legal practice contributed significantly to his understanding of how bureaucratic structures can dehumanize both those who serve them and those subject to their authority. In 1907, at the intercession of his uncle Alfred Loewy, Kafka began his first proper employment at Assicurazioni Generali, an Italian insurance company with offices on Prague's Wenceslas Square. This position represented his entry into the professional world and the beginning of his career in insurance, a field he had not chosen out of personal interest, but which offered secure employment for a law graduate. The company, founded in Trieste in 1831, was one of the largest insurance providers in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, offering various types of coverage including fire, life, and accident insurance. Kafka's role at Generali involved processing claims, drafting correspondence, and handling administrative tasks related to insurance policies. The work was routine and demanded meticulous attention to detail, qualities that Kafka possessed but which drained his creative energies when applied to tasks he found inherently meaningless. The corporate environment, with its emphasis on efficiency and conformity, felt stifling to his creative spirit. Most significantly, the working hours, from 8 a.m. to 6 p.m. with limited breaks, left him with little time or energy for writing, his true passion. The long days at the office, followed by family obligations in the evening, meant that Kafka could only write late at night, often continuing until the early hours of the morning. This schedule was physically and mentally exhausting, creating a cycle of fatigue that exacerbated his health problems and deepened his sense of alienation from his professional life. In letters and diary entries from this period, he expressed growing frustration with the constraints of his employment and its impact on his literary ambitions. After less than a year at Assicurazioni Generali, Kafka sought an escape from this unsatisfactory situation. The opportunity came in 1908 when he secured a position at the Workers' Accident Insurance Institute for the Kingdom of Bohemia, located at Narpogici Street 7. This semi-governmental organization, responsible for administering mandatory insurance for industrial workers against workplace accidents, would be Kafka's professional home for the next 14 years, providing him with financial stability while allowing somewhat more space for his literary pursuits. The Workers' Accident Insurance Institute for the Kingdom of Bohemia offered Kafka several advantages over his previous employment at the previous company. Most significantly, the working hours were shorter, typically from 8 a.m. to 2 p.m., allowing him more time for his literary pursuits. This semi-day job, as he sometimes referred to it, created a more sustainable balance between professional obligations and creative work, though the tension between these two worlds would remain a defining feature of his life. The institute itself was housed in a neo-Baroque building on Narpogici Street, its ornate exterior contrasting with the bureaucratic procedures that took place within. Kafka's office was modest but comfortable, with a desk positioned near a window that provided natural light and a view of the street below. The physical environment was less oppressive than that of Generali, and the organizational culture somewhat more relaxed, factors that contributed to Kafka's decision to remain with the institute for the majority of his working life. Kafka began at the institute as an articled clerk, the entry-level position for a law graduate. His responsibilities included processing claims from workers injured in industrial accidents, calculating compensation amounts based on complex formulas, and drafting correspondence related to these cases. The work, while still bureaucratic in nature, had a social dimension that appealed to Kafka's sense of justice and compassion. He was involved in assessing claims from injured workers, many of whom were from the most vulnerable segments of society: factory laborers, miners, construction workers, whose lives could be devastated by workplace accidents. This daily exposure to human suffering, and the often inadequate institutional responses to it, deepened Kafka's understanding of social inequities and the dehumanizing effects of industrialization. He witnessed firsthand how workers' bodies were treated as expendable components in the machinery of production, and how their pain and disability were reduced to statistical data and financial calculations. These observations would later inform his literary explorations of alienation, bodily transformation, and the individual's vulnerability within systems of power. Kafka approached these professional duties with characteristic conscientiousness and attention to detail. His legal training served him well in navigating the complex regulations and procedures involved in insurance assessment. He drafted clear, precise reports that were valued by his superiors for their accuracy and thoroughness. Colleagues remembered him as diligent, courteous, and efficient, qualities that earned him promotions and respect within the organization, despite his private ambivalence about his career path. In 1908, the same year he began working at the Insurance Institute, Kafka achieved his first publication. 8 prose pieces appeared in the first issue of the Munich-based literary magazine Hyperion, edited by Franz Kafka. These short texts, later included in the collection Meditation, represented Kafka's public debut as a writer. Though modest in scope, this publication was significant for Kafka, providing external validation of his literary efforts and connecting him to a wider audience beyond his immediate circle in Prague. Also in 1908, 8 fragments of Kafka's early fiction were published in Brod's Almanac Arcadia. This publication further cemented Kafka's position within Prague's German literary community and strengthened his friendship with Brod, who was increasingly taking on the role of literary advocate and promoter of Kafka's work. Brod's belief in Kafka's genius never wavered, even when Kafka himself was plagued by doubt about the value of his writing. Kafka's linguistic abilities were remarkable and formed an important aspect of his identity as a writer and intellectual. He wrote primarily in German, the language of his education and of high culture in Prague. His German was precise, clear, and distinctive, characterized by what critic Walter Benjamin would later describe as a linguistic purity that set him apart from many of his contemporaries. This linguistic precision was not merely a stylistic choice, but reflected Kafka's deep concern with the relationship between language and reality, his awareness of the ways in which words both reveal and conceal truth. While German was his primary literary language, Kafka also spoke Czech fluently, the language of the city's majority population and of the streets, markets, and everyday life of Prague. He had learned Czech from domestic servants in his childhood home and had continued to develop his proficiency through regular interaction with Czech speakers. This bilingualism gave him access to both the German and Czech cultural worlds of Prague, though he remained primarily identified with the city's German-speaking minority. Kafka also had a good command of French, the international language of diplomacy and culture in early 20th century Europe. He read French literature in the original and occasionally corresponded in French with friends and acquaintances. In his later years, he would also learn Hebrew, reflecting his growing interest in Jewish culture and Zionism. This multilingualism reflected the complex cultural identity of a German-speaking Jew in a predominantly Czech city, a man positioned at the intersection of multiple traditions and influences. Between 1909 and 1912, Kafka traveled extensively with Max Brod, visiting northern Italy, Paris, and Weimar. These journeys broadened his horizons and exposed him to different cultural environments, art, and architecture. In northern Italy, they visited cities like Milan, Brescia, and Riva del Garda, where Kafka was impressed by the Renaissance art and architecture, so different from the Gothic and Baroque styles that dominated Prague. In Paris, they explored the museums, cafes, and literary haunts of the French capital, immersing themselves in the vibrant cultural life of the city that was then the center of European modernism. Their visit to Weimar in Germany had special significance for Kafka as the city associated with Goethe, whose work he deeply admired. They visited Goethe's house and other sites connected with the great German writer, experiences that reinforced Kafka's sense of connection to the German literary tradition. These travels offered temporary escape from the pressures of family and work in Prague, allowing Kafka periods of relative freedom and stimulation that contrasted with the constraints of his daily routine. It was during this period, specifically in 1909, that Kafka began writing his diaries, which would become not only a record of his daily life, but also a workshop for his literary ideas and a confessional space for his innermost thoughts and anxieties. The diaries, which he would continue to keep until 1923, provide invaluable insights into his creative process, his struggles with writing, his complex relationships, and his evolving self-understanding. They reveal a mind constantly engaged in self-analysis, questioning his choices, examining his motives, and scrutinizing his failures and achievements with unflinching honesty. The diaries also served as a laboratory for Kafka's fiction, containing sketches, fragments, and early versions of stories that would later be developed into published works. They show how he worked through ideas, experimenting with narrative techniques and thematic elements before incorporating them into his formal literary creations. This intimate record of his thought processes offers a unique window into the development of one of the most distinctive literary voices of the 20th century. Kafka's health, never robust, required periodic attention throughout these years. He stayed in sanatoria focusing on natural healing in Erlenbach, 1911, Jungborn, 1912, and Riva, 1913. These facilities, often located in rural or mountainous regions, offered treatments based on principles of naturopathy, emphasizing fresh air, sunlight, vegetarian diet, hydrotherapy, and physical exercise as means to restore health and vitality. Kafka, who had been interested in alternative health approaches since his university days, embraced these regimens with characteristic thoroughness, following prescribed routines of outdoor exercise, cold baths, and dietary restrictions. These health retreats, while primarily motivated by physical concerns such as fatigue, digestive problems, and headaches, also provided psychological respite and opportunities for concentrated writing away from the distractions of Prague. The simplified daily routines, natural surroundings, and distance from family and work responsibilities created conditions conducive to reflection and creativity. Several important literary works were begun or developed during these periods of retreat, suggesting that the physical and mental space they provided was valuable for Kafka's artistic process. A pivotal moment in Kafka's cultural and spiritual development came in 1911, when he attended performances by a Yiddish theatre troupe from Lviv, then Lemberg in Galicia. The troupe, led by Yitzhak Lovi, performed plays that drew on traditional Jewish themes and folklore, presented in Yiddish, the everyday language of Eastern European Jews that combined German, Hebrew, and Slavic elements. For Kafka, whose Jewish identity had been shaped by the assimilationist tendencies of Prague's German Jewish community, these performances opened a window onto a more vibrant, authentic form of Jewish cultural expression. The encounter with Yiddish theatre awakened in Kafka a deeper connection to his Jewish heritage and sparked an interest in Yiddish culture and language that would continue throughout his life. He formed a friendship with Lowy, attended multiple performances, and even arranged for the troupe to perform for the Bar Kochba Jewish Students Association in Prague. Through Lowy, Kafka gained access to a world of Eastern European Jewish culture that was markedly different from the assimilated, bourgeois Jewish environment in which he had been raised. This experience was crucial for Kafka's relationship to Judaism and Jewish culture, which had previously been somewhat distant and formalistic. It marked the beginning of a more engaged exploration of his Jewish identity that would continue and deepen throughout his life, eventually leading to his study of Hebrew and his interest in Zionism. The influence of this encounter can be traced in several of Kafka's works, particularly those that engage with themes of tradition, community, and cultural belonging. The year 1912 represented a creative breakthrough for Kafka. He began actively writing his first novel, The Man Who Disappeared, Der Verschollene, later known as America. This work, which would remain unfinished at his death, follows the adventures of a young European immigrant named Karl Rossmann in a fantastical version of the United States. Unlike his later novels, with their claustrophobic, nightmarish qualities, America has elements of picaresque adventure and even humor, though it still explores themes of alienation, authority, and the search for belonging that would become central to Kafka's literary vision. More significantly, on the night of September 22nd to 23rd, 1912, Kafka wrote The Judgment, Das Urteil, in a single, intense burst of creativity that lasted from 10 p.m. until 6 a.m. This experience of writing an entire story in one sitting, which Kafka described in his diary as the only way in which writing can be done, only with such coherence, with such a complete opening out of the body and the soul, represented a new level of artistic achievement and confidence. The story, which tells of a young man condemned to death by drowning by his father, explores the themes of paternal authority, filial guilt, and the power of judgment that would recur throughout Kafka's work. Kafka followed this success with The Metamorphosis, written in November and December 1912. This story, which begins with the famous line, "As Gregor Samsa awoke one morning from uneasy dreams, he found himself transformed in his bed into a gigantic insect," is perhaps Kafka's most well-known work and a cornerstone of modernist literature. Its exploration of alienation, family dynamics, and the dehumanizing effects of modern life established patterns and themes that would characterize much of his subsequent writing. In December 1912, a collection of 18 short prose pieces by Kafka was published under the title Meditation by Ernst Rowohlt Verlag in Leipzig. This marked his first book publication, a significant milestone in his literary career. The collection, which included pieces previously published in Hyperion and other venues, showcased Kafka's distinctive style and sensibility, his precise observation, his ability to find the uncanny in the everyday, and his exploration of isolation and miscommunication. Though still relatively unknown outside a small circle of Prague intellectuals, Kafka was beginning to establish himself as a writer of unique vision and talent. August 13, 1912, marked a significant turning point in Kafka's personal life when he met Felice Bauer at Max Brod's house in Prague. Brod had invited several friends for dinner, including Ludwig Winder and Felice, who was visiting from Berlin. This seemingly ordinary social gathering would initiate one of the most complex and tormented relationships of Kafka's life, one that would span 5 years and generate over 500 letters, providing both inspiration for his work and profound emotional turmoil. Felice Bauer was 24 years old, a confident, practical woman who worked as a representative for a dictaphone company in Berlin. She was modern in her outlook, financially independent and career-oriented, qualities unusual for women of her time and social background. In his diary entry the day after their meeting, Kafka described her as having a bony, empty face that wore its emptiness openly, noting her bare throat and how her hair was combed over her ears. This initial, somewhat clinical description gave little indication of the intense attachment that would develop between them. Felice was, in many ways, Kafka's opposite. Where he was introspective, plagued by self-doubt and torn between competing demands, she was outgoing, self-assured, and decisively engaged with the practical world. She embodied a directness and certainty that both attracted and intimidated Kafka. Their relationship would unfold primarily through correspondence, with only occasional face-to-face meetings, a mode of interaction that allowed Kafka to present himself in his most articulate form through the written word, while avoiding the immediate demands of physical presence. Kafka initiated their correspondence on September 20, 1912, with a letter that began formally but quickly established a tone of intimate confession. Over the following months, the frequency and intensity of their letters increased dramatically. Kafka wrote to Felice almost daily, sometimes sending multiple letters in a single day. In these letters, he shared his literary ambitions, his daily frustrations, his health concerns, and his existential anxieties. He described his writing process in detail, making her a virtual witness to his creative struggles and achievements. Yet he also revealed, perhaps unconsciously, his profound ambivalence about marriage and domestic life. While expressing desire for Felice and painting pictures of their potential future together, he simultaneously emphasized the ascetic conditions necessary for his writing: solitude, silence, freedom from social obligations, conditions that seemed incompatible with conventional marriage. This fundamental contradiction would remain unresolved throughout their relationship, creating a pattern of approach and retreat that caused suffering for both parties. During this period of intense correspondence with Felice, Kafka's literary output flourished. The emotional energy and psychological complexity of their relationship seemed to fuel his creativity, providing material that he transformed into some of his most significant works. In November 1912, he wrote to Felice about his progress on The Metamorphosis, sharing details of the story's development and his satisfaction with certain passages. This pattern of using their correspondence as a kind of creative sounding board would continue throughout their relationship. By the spring of 1913, the relationship had deepened to the point where marriage was being discussed, though Kafka's ambivalence remained evident in his letters. In May and June, he visited Felice in Berlin, staying at the Askanischer Hof Hotel. These visits allowed them to develop their relationship beyond the written word, though Kafka often felt awkward and inadequate in person, lacking the eloquence and control he possessed in his letters. The physical reality of Felice, her presence, her family connections, her social world in Berlin, both attracted and alarmed him, making concrete what had previously existed primarily in the realm of imagination and language. On June 16, 1913, Kafka wrote a letter to Felice's father, Karl Bauer, formally requesting permission to marry his daughter. This traditional step reflected the social conventions of the time, particularly in Jewish families. Karl Bauer, a successful businessman, had reservations about Kafka as a potential son-in-law, questioning whether his modest income as an insurance official could adequately support a family. These practical concerns added another layer of complexity to an already fraught situation. Despite these obstacles, Kafka and Felice became unofficially engaged in the summer of 1913. The engagement, however, was marked by Kafka's continuing doubts and his increasingly desperate attempts to explain to Felice the demands of his writing life. In a letter from July 1913, he wrote, "I have often thought that the best mode of life for me would be to sit in the innermost room of a spacious locked cellar with my writing things and a lamp. And how I would write! From the depths I would drag it up. Without effort. For extreme concentration knows no effort." This vision of isolated creative work stood in stark contrast to the social and familial responsibilities of marriage. Kafka's awareness of this contradiction led to periods of intense anxiety and guilt. He felt he was deceiving Felice by pursuing marriage while knowing he could not be the kind of husband she deserved and expected. These feelings contributed to his decision to break off the engagement in July 1914 before it had been formally announced. During this first engagement period, Kafka also met Greta Bloch, a friend of Felice's who sometimes acted as an intermediary between the couple. Greta, intelligent and literary-minded, understood Kafka's artistic temperament in ways that Felice sometimes did not. His connection with Greta added another layer of complexity to an already fraught situation. Some scholars have suggested that Kafka may have had a brief affair with Greta, and there has been speculation that she may have borne him a child who died in infancy, though conclusive evidence for this remains elusive. The year 1914 was significant for Kafka in other ways as well. It marked his first move away from his parents' home when he rented an apartment in Bilkova Street in Prague's Old Town. This physical separation represented an attempt at greater independence and self-determination, though his emotional ties to his family, particularly the complicated relationship with his father, remained powerful. The apartment was modest, but provided him with a space of his own, away from the watchful eyes and expectations of his parents. This move reflected his growing need for autonomy, both personal and creative. During this period, Kafka worked on his novels The Trial, Der Prozess, and The Man Who Disappeared, as well as the short story In the Penal Colony, in Der Strafkolonie. The Trial, begun in August 1914 and left unfinished at his death, tells the story of Joseph K., who is arrested and prosecuted by a remote authority without ever learning the nature of his crime. The novel's exploration of guilt, bureaucratic absurdity, and the individual's helplessness before impersonal systems of power reflects Kafka's own experiences with authority. From his relationship with his father to his observations of legal and governmental institutions. In the Penal Colony, written in October 1914, is a disturbing tale of torture and execution that reflects his preoccupation with power, punishment, and the body. The story describes a complex execution machine that inscribes the sentence on the condemned person's body until they die. This brutal mechanism serves as a metaphor for the ways in which social and political systems inscribe their laws and judgments on human bodies and psyches, a theme that resonates with Kafka's personal experiences of feeling judged and constrained by family, work, and society. In 1915, The Metamorphosis was published for the first time by Kurt Wolff's publishing house in Leipzig. This story, with its unforgettable opening line and its exploration of alienation, family dynamics, and the dehumanizing effects of modern life, would become one of Kafka's most recognized and influential works. Its publication represented a significant step in his literary career, bringing his work to a wider audience and establishing his reputation as a writer of singular vision and power. The following year, 1916, saw Kafka renting a room in 22 Golden Lane, Zlata Uliczka, in Prague Castle, a tiny, almost cell-like space where he could write in solitude. The house, part of a row of small dwellings built into the castle walls, had originally housed castle guards and later became home to craftsmen and artists. Kafka's room was barely large enough for a bed, a desk, and a chair, but its isolation and quiet provided ideal conditions for writing. It was here that he wrote the short stories later published as A Country Doctor, Ein Landarzt, a collection that includes some of his most enigmatic and dreamlike tales. The confined space of the room on Golden Lane, with its medieval atmosphere and isolation from the bustle of the city below, provided an environment conducive to the creation of Kafka's distinctive literary world, a world of compression, intensity, and strange transformations. The physical constraints of the space seem to mirror the concentrated, claustrophobic quality of his prose. Kafka would work here in the evenings and at night after his day job at the Insurance Institute, sometimes writing until dawn before returning to his family's apartment to sleep for a few hours before going to work. In 1917, Kafka published A Report to an Academy, the tragicomic monologue of an ape who has learned to behave like a human in order to escape captivity. The story's exploration of assimilation, performance, and the loss of authentic identity resonates with Kafka's own experience as a Jewish intellectual in a predominantly Christian society, a German speaker in a Czech city, and a sensitive artist in a bureaucratic profession. The ape's transformation represents both a survival strategy and a form of self-betrayal, a duality that Kafka felt in his own accommodations to social expectations. March 1917 saw Kafka renting an apartment in the Schönborn Palace in the Lesser Town, today's US Embassy. This grand setting, with its Baroque architecture and aristocratic associations, contrasted sharply with the modest room on Golden Lane. The palace, built in the 17th century for the noble Schönborn family, had been divided into apartments by the early 20th century. Kafka's rooms were on the top floor, offering views over the city and a more spacious environment than his previous lodgings. It was here that he wrote The Great Wall of China, a story inspired by Prague's Hunger Wall, a medieval structure built during a famine to provide employment. The Great Wall of China explores themes of monumental, seemingly purposeless construction projects and the disconnect between rulers and the ruled. The wall, built in sections that never connect, becomes a metaphor for human efforts to create meaning and security in a world where ultimate purposes remain obscure. The story reflects Kafka's ongoing preoccupation with authority, meaning, and the individual's place within vast, impersonal systems, concerns that were deeply rooted in his personal experiences and observations of early 20th century European society. August 1917 brought the first signs of the tuberculosis that would eventually claim Kafka's life. He experienced a pulmonary hemorrhage, coughing up blood, a classic symptom of the disease, which led to a medical examination and diagnosis. Tuberculosis, then commonly known as consumption, was a widespread and feared disease in early 20th century Europe. Before the development of effective antibiotics in the mid-20th century, it was often fatal, particularly in its advanced stages. The diagnosis was a profound shock to Kafka, forcing him to confront his mortality in a new and immediate way. This health crisis led to the cancellation of his second engagement to Felice Bauer, marking the definitive end of their long, complicated relationship. Kafka's awareness of his illness intensified his sense of isolation and his conviction that he was unsuited for conventional marriage and family life. He wrote to Felice that he was mentally ill and that "my illness and your physical well-being do not go together." This final separation, while painful for both parties, reflected Kafka's recognition that their life paths were fundamentally incompatible. A recognition that his illness had made impossible to ignore or rationalize away. Following the tuberculosis diagnosis, Kafka took a health holiday to his sister Ottilie's farm in Sejem, Surreal, in northwestern Bohemia. Ottla, the youngest of his sisters and the one to whom he felt closest, had leased the farm as part of her own quest for independence from their father's influence. She invited Franz to stay, hoping the rural environment would benefit his health and spirits. This rural retreat provided a respite from the pressures of Prague and the Insurance Institute. In the quiet of the countryside, surrounded by nature and free from the demands of office work, Kafka found a measure of peace and clarity. He stayed in Surreal from September 1917 to April 1918, one of the longest periods he spent away from Prague. During these months, he lived simply, helping with farm tasks when his health permitted, taking long walks in the surrounding fields and woods, and writing regularly. He wrote a series of aphorisms and reflections during this period, later published as the Surreal Aphorisms, which distill his philosophical and spiritual insights into brief, often enigmatic statements. These aphorisms touch on themes of truth, suffering, evil, and transcendence, revealing a mind grappling with fundamental questions of existence in the shadow of illness and mortality. The Surreal period represented a kind of pastoral interlude in Kafka's otherwise urban existence. The rhythms of rural life, the close connection to natural cycles, and the distance from urban social pressures allowed him a different perspective on his life and work. In letters from this time, he expressed appreciation for the simplicity and authenticity of country life, contrasting it favorably with the artificiality and constraints he associated with city living. This experience reinforced his long-standing ambivalence about modern urban civilization and its effects on human consciousness and community. The years 1918 to 1923 were characterized by Kafka's increasingly frequent stays in various sanatoria, interrupted by brief periods of work at the Insurance Institute. His tuberculosis, though temporarily stabilized, remained a constant threat, requiring regular medical attention and periods of rest away from Prague's pollution and the stresses of urban life. These years represented a gradual withdrawal from conventional social and professional life, as Kafka's focus increasingly turned inward, toward his writing, his health, and his exploration of spiritual and existential questions. In 1918, following his extended stay at his sister's farm in Zurau, Kafka spent time at Pensionstudel in Jelizy, Schellissen, near Mielnik, a small resort town north of Prague. The pension, situated in a wooded area near the Elbe River, offered simple accommodations and a peaceful environment conducive to rest and recovery. It was here that Kafka met Julie Vorizek, a young woman from a modest Jewish family who was also staying at the pension for health reasons. Julie, with her unpretentious manner and lack of literary sophistication, represented a different type of female companionship than Kafka had experienced with the educated, career-oriented Felice Bauer. Their connection developed quickly, based on mutual attraction and a shared experience of convalescence. Julie's straightforward nature and absence of intellectual pretension appealed to Kafka, offering a refreshing contrast to the complex, often fraught dynamics of his relationship with Felice. By the autumn of 1918, they had become engaged, planning a simple life together that would accommodate Kafka's need for quiet and his fragile health. This engagement, however, met with fierce opposition from Hermann Kafka. When Franz informed his father of his plans to marry Julie, Hermann responded with contempt, dismissing her as a common waitress. She had worked briefly in a hotel, and suggesting that Franz could find a better match. This reaction reflected not only Hermann's social snobbery, but also his continuing need to control his son's life choices, even as Franz approached his 40th year. The conflict came at a particularly sensitive time, as the end of World War I and the collapse of the Austro-Hungarian Empire had created political and economic uncertainties that heightened Hermann's concerns about his son's financial security. Faced with his father's disapproval, Kafka ultimately terminated the engagement to Julie, a painful capitulation that reflected the continuing power of Hermann Kafka over his adult son's life choices. This surrender to paternal authority was particularly poignant given Franz's age and his previous attempts to establish independence. It demonstrated the profound psychological hold that Hermann maintained over his son, a dynamic that Franz had struggled with throughout his life and that had shaped much of his writing. This conflict with his father over the engagement to Julie prompted Kafka to write his famous Letter to his Father, Briefen den Vater, in November 1919, a document that runs to more than 100 pages. In this letter, which was never actually delivered to Hermann, Kafka articulates with extraordinary precision and insight the nature of their troubled relationship and its impact on his development as a person and as a writer. He describes his father's overwhelming physical and psychological presence, his own feelings of inadequacy and guilt, and the ways in which paternal authority had shaped and, in Kafka's view, damaged his sense of self. "I was a timid child," he writes. "Nevertheless, I am sure that I was also stubborn, as children are. I am sure that mother spoiled me too, but I cannot believe that I was particularly difficult to handle. I cannot believe that a kindly word, a quiet taking by the hand, a friendly look, could not have got from me whatever anyone wanted." This poignant reflection on his childhood need for gentleness and affirmation, contrasted with his father's harsh judgments and intimidating manner, reveals the emotional core of their conflict. The letter represents one of the most profound and penetrating analyses of the father-son relationship in literature. Its psychological acuity and emotional honesty make it not only a key to understanding Kafka's personal history, but also a document of broader significance for exploring family dynamics and the formation of identity. Though Hermann never read the letter, Franz gave it to his mother, who returned it without passing it on. The act of writing it may have provided Franz with a measure of catharsis and clarity about this central relationship in his life. In 1920, Kafka's health continued to deteriorate, and he spent time in a sanatorium in Merano, Italy. The Mediterranean climate was thought to be beneficial for tuberculosis patients, and the change of scenery provided some respite from the familiar pressures of Prague. The sanatorium offered various treatments considered helpful for tuberculosis at the time, including rest cures, dietary regimens, and exposure to fresh air and sunshine. These approaches, while not curative, could sometimes slow the progress of the disease and alleviate symptoms. During this period, Kafka developed a significant relationship with journalist and translator Milena, the first translator of his fiction into Czech. Their connection, like many of Kafka's relationships, unfolded primarily through correspondence, with over 100 letters exchanged between them in 1920 alone. These letters, later published as Letters to Milena, reveal an intense intellectual and emotional connection that developed rapidly despite limited face-to-face contact. Milena was a remarkable woman, intelligent, passionate, and independent. Born in 1896 to a prominent Czech family, she had rebelled against her strict upbringing and conventional expectations for women of her class. She was married to Ernst Pollock, a Jewish intellectual and friend of Max Brod, but lived separately from him in Vienna, embodying a freedom and modernity that both attracted and intimidated Kafka. As a journalist and translator, she moved in literary and artistic circles, writing on culture, politics, and women's issues for various publications. Their correspondence began when Milena, impressed by Kafka's stories, wrote to him requesting permission to translate his work into Czech. This professional inquiry quickly evolved into a deeply personal exchange. Kafka confided in her his deepest thoughts and fears, while she offered understanding and appreciation of his literary genius at a time when his work was still largely unknown. Milena's translations helped introduce Kafka to Czech readers, bridging the linguistic divide that separated him from the majority population of his native city. Their letters reveal a relationship of extraordinary intensity and honesty. Kafka wrote to her about his illness, his writing, his dreams, and his anxieties with a frankness he rarely showed to others. Milena responded with warmth, insight, and an acceptance of his complexities that he found both comforting and somewhat overwhelming. Their correspondence has a quality of mutual revelation and discovery, as if each had found in the other a unique mirror for their own thoughts and feelings. Despite the profound connection they shared, Kafka ultimately retreated from the possibility of a life with Milena. His tuberculosis, his ingrained hesitancy about intimate relationships, and perhaps his recognition of the fundamental differences in their temperaments. She embraced life with a vigor and directness that contrasted with his own cautious, introspective nature. All contributed to his decision to maintain distance. Their correspondence dwindled by 1923, though Milena would remain one of the people who understood him most deeply. After Kafka's death, she would write, "He was a man who knew the human soul. He understood it as it can only be understood by someone who has lived in the depths of loneliness." In 1921, Kafka's health necessitated another stay in a sanatorium, this time in Matliar in the High Tatras Mountains, now part of Slovakia. The mountain air was considered particularly beneficial for tuberculosis patients, and the remote location offered a complete change from urban life. The following year, he spent time in Spindlerův Mlýn, Spindelmühle, in the Krkonoše Mountains and in Planá nad Lužnicí in southern Bohemia. These periods of isolation and convalescence, while physically challenging, often provided Kafka with the solitude and focus necessary for his writing. It was during this period that he worked on The Castle, Das Schloss, a novel that would be published posthumously in 1926. The novel tells the story of a man known only as K, who arrives in a village dominated by a mysterious castle whose authorities never grant him the recognition he seeks. K's futile attempts to reach the castle and establish his position as the land surveyor he claims to be led him through a series of bizarre encounters with villagers and minor officials, none of which bring him any closer to his goal. The novel's themes of bureaucratic labyrinth, inaccessible authority, and the individual's futile quest for belonging and validation reflect Kafka's own experiences and preoccupations. The setting, A snow-covered village in winter, isolated and enclosed, creates an atmosphere of claustrophobia and stasis that mirrors K's psychological state. The unfinished nature of the work, it breaks off mid-sentence, seems almost emblematic of Kafka's life and career, cut short before their full realization. During this same period, Kafka also wrote The Hunger Artist, a short story about a performer who fasts for public entertainment, only to be forgotten and replaced by a young panther that draws larger crowds. The story explores themes of art, sacrifice, and the artist's relationship to society. Concerns that were deeply personal for Kafka, who often felt that his dedication to writing demanded sacrifices in other areas of life and went largely unappreciated by the world at large. The Hunger Artist's insistence that he fasts not as a feat, but because he couldn't find the food I liked, suggests the involuntary nature of the true artist's vocation, a compulsion rather than a choice. In 1922, Kafka's professional life reached its culmination when he was promoted to the position of Chief Secretary at the Workers' Accident Insurance Institute. This advancement recognized his years of diligent service and his expertise in insurance matters. His responsibilities now included supervising other employees, representing the Institute at meetings and conferences, and handling more complex cases and policy issues. The promotion came with an increase in salary and status, providing greater financial security at a time when post-war inflation was creating economic hardship for many. However, his deteriorating health soon made it impossible for him to continue working. The physical demands of daily office attendance, combined with the mental strain of administrative responsibilities, proved too much for his weakened constitution. He requested early retirement for medical reasons, which was granted with a pension, a financial security that would support him in his final years. This departure from the Institute marked the end of Kafka's double life as bureaucrat and writer, a duality that had defined his adult existence for 14 years. The year 1923 marked another significant turning point in Kafka's personal life. While staying in Müritz, a Baltic Sea resort, he met Dora, a young woman from an Orthodox Jewish family in Galicia. Dora, 25 years old to Kafka's 40, was working at a Jewish vacation camp for children. She had left her traditional family to pursue education and independence, first in Krakow and then in Berlin. She was a Hasidic girl with Zionist convictions, embodying a vibrant connection to Jewish tradition and culture that fascinated Kafka. Their meeting sparked an immediate and profound connection. In Dora, Kafka found someone who shared his growing interest in Judaism and Zionism, who appreciated his literary work, and who offered him a warmth and acceptance he had rarely experienced. For perhaps the first time in his life, Kafka entered into a relationship that was not primarily conducted through letters but lived in daily intimacy. Dora later recalled their first conversation, noting how Kafka's gentle manner and attentive listening immediately set him apart from other men she had known. In a bold move that broke with his previous patterns of hesitation and retreat, Kafka decided to move to Berlin with Dora in the autumn of 1923. This decision represented a significant act of independence from his family, particularly his father. By choosing to live with Dora without marriage, though they presented themselves as husband and wife, in a city far from Prague, Kafka was asserting his autonomy in a way he had rarely done before. The move coincided with a period of hyperinflation in Germany, creating practical challenges for the couple, but also a sense of shared adventure and mutual support in difficult circumstances. The Berlin period, despite the severe economic hardships of Germany's hyperinflation era and Kafka's worsening health, was in many ways a time of personal fulfillment. Dora created a supportive environment that allowed Kafka to focus on his writing. She understood and respected his need for solitude and creative space, while providing the companionship and care he increasingly required as his illness progressed. Their small apartment in Steglitz, at a suburb of Berlin, became what Kafka described as a writing laboratory, emphasizing how conducive it was to his work. During this time, Kafka's interest in Judaism deepened significantly. He studied Hebrew with dedication, reading from the Torah daily and engaging with Jewish texts and traditions. His teacher, Pua ben Tovim, noted his exceptional commitment and rapid progress in learning the language. His diaries indicate that he dreamt about living in Palestine, a dream he shared with Dora, who was actively involved in Zionist circles. This engagement with his Jewish heritage represented a kind of homecoming for Kafka, a reconnection with cultural and spiritual roots that had been somewhat attenuated in his assimilated upbringing. In Berlin, Kafka wrote his short story, The Burrow, a tale narrated by an unidentified creature who has built an elaborate underground dwelling to protect itself from undefined threats. The creature's obsessive efforts to perfect its burrow, its constant vigilance against potential invaders, and its inability to ever feel truly secure reflect Kafka's own anxieties about safety, vulnerability, and the futile quest for absolute protection. Like many of his works, it remained unfinished, breaking off at a point of heightened tension when the narrator becomes aware of a mysterious noise that may indicate the approach of an enemy. By March 1924, Kafka's tuberculosis had advanced to a critical stage. His throat was affected, making eating and drinking extremely painful, a cruel affliction for someone who had always been fastidious about his diet and health. The laryngeal tuberculosis, a complication of pulmonary tuberculosis, created lesions in his throat that made swallowing an agony and eventually made it impossible for him to take nourishment. This condition, combined with the general weakness caused by the disease, led to rapid physical decline. Max Brod and Kafka's uncle Siegfried Loewy traveled to Berlin, and recognizing the severity of his condition, moved him back to Prague to his parents' house in Old Town Square. The return to Prague and to his family home must have been emotionally complex for Kafka. He had finally achieved a measure of independence and personal happiness with Dora, only to be forced by illness back into the familial environment from which he had struggled to separate himself. Yet the practical necessities of his care made the move unavoidable. Despite his rapidly failing health, Kafka continued to write. In March and April 1924, he worked on Josephine the Singer, or The Mousefolk, which would be his last completed story. This tale of a mouse who believes her singing is uniquely valuable to her community, though they value her more for other reasons, explores themes of art, community, and the artist's place within society, concerns that had occupied Kafka throughout his literary career. The story's gentle irony and its meditation on the relationship between the individual and the collective represent a kind of summation of Kafka's artistic vision. In April 1924, recognizing that Prague's climate was detrimental to his condition, Kafka, accompanied by Dora Diamant and his physician Robert Klopstock, moved to the sanatorium in Kierling near Klosterneuburg, Lower Austria. The sanatorium, directed by Dr. Hugo Hoffmann, specialized in the treatment of tuberculosis and offered the most advanced care available at the time, though medical science still had few effective treatments for advanced cases like Kafka's. Here, in a peaceful rural setting, Kafka spent his final months. His physical suffering was intense. The tuberculosis had progressed to his larynx, making speaking and swallowing excruciatingly painful. He was reduced to communicating through written notes, further isolating him in his final days. His weight dropped dramatically as he became unable to eat, and he required morphine for pain management. Yet visitors remarked on his mental clarity and his continued interest in literature and ideas. He read proofs of his story, The Hunger Artist, which was to be published in a literary magazine, making corrections and suggestions until near the end. Dora remained by his side, reading to him when he could no longer read himself, and providing comfort in his final days. Their relationship, though brief in duration, had brought Kafka a rare experience of domestic happiness and acceptance. In Dora, he had found someone who embraced him fully, as a man, as a writer, and as a Jew, without the reservations or conditions that had characterized so many of his other relationships. Max Brod also visited regularly, maintaining the friendship that had been central to Kafka's literary life for over 2 decades. On June 3, 1924, Franz Kafka died at the sanatorium in Kierling. He was 40 years old. The immediate cause of death was laryngeal tuberculosis, which had spread from his lungs to his throat, essentially causing him to starve to death as swallowing became impossible. His final hours were attended by Dora and Dr. Klopstock, who later reported that Kafka faced death with remarkable equanimity. According to Klopstock, Kafka's last request was for morphine to hasten the end, saying, "Kill me, or else you are a murderer," a plea that reflected both his suffering and his clear-eyed recognition of his situation. On June 11, 1924, Kafka was buried in the family vault in the new Jewish cemetery in Prague, Straschnitz. His funeral was attended by a small group of family and friends, including his parents, sisters, Max Brod, and several colleagues from the Insurance Institute. The rabbi who officiated knew little of Kafka personally or professionally, delivering a generic eulogy that failed to capture the unique qualities of the man or his work. The tombstone, created by architect Leopold Ehrmann, bears a simple inscription with his name and dates. In death, as in life, Kafka's public presence was modest and unassuming, giving little indication of the profound literary legacy he would leave behind.